Sara and Shireen they're going to be in conversation discussing women's work, job exit and crisis, and how this has changed in the post-pandemic era. But let me just introduce them. So Dr. Sara de Benedictis is a senior lecturer. She's a cultural sociologist and researches gender, class and media, and is working on a piece of research entitled Representation, Reproduction and Resistance. And we have Professor Shireen Kanji, a professor of human resource management here at Brunel, and she studies gender inequality in organizations and has a long-standing interest in understanding the desire for children and how it links to the labor market outcomes differentially for men and women. So now we're going to have this conversation. Thank you, Sara and Shireen.
Thank you so much, Joanna. So Sara and I have been having some conversations about what we wanted to talk about today. And I think that in listening to the previous speakers, I was really struck by how our work, really looks at issues from different angles, but in ways that are really very much connected. And I think what we perhaps we are coming at it from a slightly different angle. Well, we are coming from different angles ourselves, and we are also coming from a slightly different angle in that we're not just looking at how fertility impacts, for example, work, but we are interested in how broader social norms and patterns of work and even the system of capitalism has impacts on fertility and the way that fertility is realized. And we both have a long-standing interest in gender inequality and women's ability to control their own bodies and their fertility has long been a central concern of feminists. And it is that sort of partly motivates our interests. I wanted to just say that marriage laws in the US and Europe guaranteed a man access to his wife's body, providing a man with the legal right to have intercourse with his wife with or without her consent. If we look back over the laws, I mean, they are really revealing women's inferior position in society. And although perhaps that might be less visible to us today, I think that there are still ways in which women are pushed into subordinate positions, and gender relations, understanding gender relations is critical to understanding fertility and how fertility desires are realized. I was very interested and pleased to be invited to this talk because I think that there are connections between the social and the technological that perhaps we don't look at enough in relation to fertility. I think that social scientists, that fertility is a central preoccupation of social scientists. But perhaps we don't really make obvious how the social and the technological really interconnect. And so I wanted to talk about three areas in which they do really connect, and in which people sort of note the connection, but I think perhaps don't really explore it sufficiently. So the first is in relation to the introduction of the contraceptive pill. And I think a widely held view is that the contraceptive pill is what has unleashed fertility decline. But I think it's important to remember that fertility decline in the United States and certainly in France predated the introduction of the contraceptive pill. The technological was embedded in a situation in which societies were already changing, social norms were changing about what people wanted in relation to their fertility. And I think perhaps we still don't understand that well what drives people's desires for fertility. The second, I mean, also it is important to note that in many countries where contraceptives have been available, fertility decline has not actually been achieved. And that is because, it is not really chimed with the social environment and the desires of people in those environments. So the second second example I wanted to give, which I think is quite illustrative, is this that technology has made it possible to scan babies and tell what the sex of a baby will be. But it's social life that has made son preference socially desirable. And to the extent that we have a sex ratio of birth in China of 1.12 and 1.11 in India, so there are 1.12 male babies born for each female baby in China. It did peak at 1.17. So I think this really sort of shows us how the social is so critical to understanding fertility. In relation to the work that you are conducting, the scientists in this group, that actually I think it's quite interesting to think about the social changes that are likely to occur, or the organizational changes linking to Sandy's work that might be brought about by changes in the use of assisted conceptions, which now account for about 5% of live births in some European countries, even 9% in Denmark. So I wanted so our intention in this conversation is to focus more on the social determinants of fertility and looking at how they might connect with the technological possibilities. I remember when I first started teaching, I asked my students, well, why don't women do better in work? Why? And this was like 20 years ago. And some of them, almost very consistently, I would have one or two, usually male students, saying, well, women have to breastfeed. It was a sort of biologically deterministic argument that women will not be able to get on because they need to breastfeed. I don't think people really say that so much anymore. But breastfeeding, I think it is an aspect of work. And with that in mind, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about how you think about the work that goes around fertility and women's work.
Thanks, Shireen. Thanks for starting us off. Yeah, I think it's really important for us to think about what we mean by work. So far, we've kind of had work and reproductional caring as kind of separate fields. And I think when we're thinking about having it all, actually, we need to kind of complicate that thinking a little bit more. So my research has historically been concerned with questions about gender and work, but I've also been interested in gender in the workplace in a general sense, but more specifically, my research has looked at work and subjectivities in relation to birth and pregnancy and mothering, which some see as a type of work, although in kind of everyday parlance, we might not talk about it in terms of work. So scholars like Silvia Federici and Gargi Bhattacharya would refer to this type of work as social reproduction, an idea that some say has originated in debates about wages for housework and worklessness since the 1970s. So Federici sees social reproduction as a way to shine, and to quote Federici, the spotlight on the work that produces the workforce. And Bhattacharya calls this type of work life-making activities. And to quote Bhattacharya, these are activities and institutions that are required for making life, maintaining life, and generationally replacing life. Now, this type of work that we've kind of been talking about is often pitted against productive work, right, in a capitalist society, waged work, and they're often opposed or positioned as opposed. And so while I've been kind of coming to these theorizations more recently, my PhD work was interested in this, in that type of work, social reproduction. I looked at representations of birth and how a group of women reacted to these representations of birth. And since then, I've been interested in work about motherhood more generally, pregnancy, menstruation, and more recently about reproduction. So my perspective is more about how various debates about work and social reproduction and reproductive politics more recently how these are playing out through media, politics, and the everyday, and as they are progressively reproductive rights under threat in various national contexts. So in my view, we need to think about how to kind of challenge these threats. We need to think about how the role of media, what that plays in terms of reproductive politics, but others would obviously have a different perspective. As well as how these debates and discussions like the ones we're having now relate to broader socio-political shifts. So I wanted to just kind of introduce that into our conversation with Shireen. So to not only talk about work in the context of kind of the workplace, but also to kind of broaden out our ideas about what we're thinking about, how we're thinking about work and how we can equally value these different types of work. So I wanted to pass back to Shireen and kind of ask her how she's historically thought about work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I mean, yesterday, in fact, I spoke to a journalist on the Eye, and she was talking to me about stay-at-home girlfriends, which is something that I had not really heard about. And so, you know, I quickly looked up on what she was talking about, and I saw there were quite a number of stories about the stay-at-home girlfriend. And it really reinforced for me what you were just saying about the power of the media, that actually I wasn't aware of this story, and I don't really think it represents any big trend, because women's labour force participation is at historically high levels. It's around 71%. It's almost equal to men's labour force participation in the UK, you know, which is something really dramatically different. And women still experience a gender pay gap. There's still, well, you know, men and women experience this gender pay gap. And I think it is really important for us to keep thinking about the relationships between men and women. And this really comes across in these media representations. And I wondered whether it was of such interest. It's sort of more, I was more interested in our reaction to these stories. It's like the stay-at-home mother. Somehow it sort of lights up our kind of interest in returning to traditional models of gender relations. And, you know, somehow that seems to sort of still chime in our society. It still seems to be the right thing to do. And many feminists who write about reproduction have said that, well, there are two stages really in achieving greater sort of equality. And the first is that women enter into the public sphere, they enter into paid work. And then that occasions a change in men's behaviour in relation to housework. So what we have seen is that women have entered the public sphere in many countries. That has happened. But we've seen very little change actually in housework. Over, you know, really people said, well, housework, men will start doing the housework once women are earning. But you know, there's been really a lot of resistance to a changing division of domestic work. I think where men have participated more is in relation to childcare, and we've seen that that seems to be a more acceptable form of care for men to be involved in. Partly it's related to these ideas about caring fathers, which is also really closely linked to media representations, what's acceptable, what has become, you know, more of a social norm. So I think that you know, I think that the I'm not really sure what is, I mean, of course I'm not sure, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think that the Nordic countries do give us quite an interesting sort of pointer. People had said, well, I think that people were hopeful, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, people were really hopeful that we could see that in countries that had more sort of egalitarian gender norms were able to recover fertility. And, you know, just like Veronica was talking in relation to the mother heroes of the Soviet Union, I think that there was, you know, a desire to boost fertility rates across many, many countries. And the Nordic countries did that by providing universal childcare for children over the age of 1. And they were quite successful in boosting their fertility rates. But in the last 10 years, we've seen that changing. And we've also seen that there's much more stratification going on, where there's been a real reversal in those Nordic countries. And I suspect it may happen elsewhere, where they are finding now that whereas it used to be that women without education had higher fertility, the reverse is happening now. It's women with the highest levels of education are attaining higher levels of fertility than women with lower levels of fertility. And I think this, I suspect this is going to happen in the UK, because I've also seen a study that shows that realized fertility is much lower. Realized fertility relative to desired fertility is much lower for women who are doing working class jobs in the UK. So I think all these sort of connections between fertility, caring, and working are really quite intricately bound together. And I wonder if you could give me your perspective on that.
Thanks, Shireen. I kind of, when you're talking about fertility rates falling, it made me think of some research by Catherine Rottenberg. So it's not exactly my research, but I'll go in to talk a little bit more about mine in a sec. So Catherine Rottenberg's written this really great book called The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism, right? And in this book, Rottenberg investigates with great detail this concept of the neoliberal feminist that's happening in kind of the cultural sphere. And what she argues in her book is that this idea of neoliberal feminism calls forth a middle class white subject who is shaped and is shaping discourses about balance and happiness. We've talked about this at the start. Feminism is framed increasingly as a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and women are pushed towards investing into what is considered to be their most fertile years. So Rottenberg argues that this positions feminism as necessary for broader political and economic systems like neoliberalism, but it also positions neoliberal feminism as in a kind of increasingly rationalized and individualized term. So when Rottenberg talks about fertility in her book, she talks about how we can see that actually some workplaces are encouraging women to work, but at the same time, and in terms of careers, but at the same time, they've got to invest in their fertility. And one example Rottenberg uses is that companies like Apple and Facebook are increasingly offering egg freezing as a contractual perk to the job. But as Rottenberg points out in her book, and I think it was in 2018, egg freezing is experimental. And indeed, more recently, we've seen that whilst egg freezing is seen as kind of the way to secure fertility, and it's encouraged kind of on some levels, we were seeing more reports recently that say that it's not as reliable as one might hope. So a report in The Guardian in November talked after Jennifer Aniston had talked about how she wished she had frozen her eggs. It caused scientists to come out and say that egg freezing is a, quote, lottery, not a guarantee. And so we can see that workplaces are kind of getting involved in these technological perks, but it's actually uncertain how successful they are. So it seems a bit problematic that that's happening. And at the same time, whilst workplaces are kind of encouraging women to work and are trying to enable these types of perks, you also don't see, I think workplaces are lacking when it comes to supporting those who care for children, but also care for others. And in the first presentation, actually, some of that problematic stuff around caring was discussed. So again, it's a paradox that on the one hand, fertility is supported on the surface and is encouraged, but then on the other hand, actually caring for children in the workplace isn't as supported as it should be. So this leads us really to question kind of what happens when work as in a career and when work as in reproduction and caring is not compatible. And Lora was kind of talking about this as well in her talk. But I wanted to briefly talk about some of the work I did with Shani Orgad at the London School of Economics and Political Science back in 2015, when we were talking about the stay-at-home mum. And we analysed news representations of the cultural figure of the stay-at-home mum between 2008 and 2013. And what we found was this figure was represented as a white middle-class woman within the context of a post-recession context. I'm not seeing context twice, sorry there. And interestingly, this choice, the choice to be a stay-at-home mum, even though it was sometimes framed as a result of structural inequalities to do with the recession, it was still framed as the woman's independent choice. And this choice was valorized because she was seen to support often the ultra economic productivity of her husband. So we can see how, even though there are structural constraints going on, it plays out through the individual in quite problematic ways. Orgad then went on to write a really great book called Heading Home, which I think you should all read. And she further speaks about the incompatibility between caring and working, and some of the decisions that women feel they have to make in the context of this incompatibility. Now, we can see that this is happening even more, and it's also being reported on the news. People are exiting from the workforce. And this is happening as childcare costs are prohibitively expensive in the UK, but also as there's a cost of living crisis, this is talked about. And we can see that this is usually talked about in terms of middle class women, but if you're thinking about it in terms of working class women, this is all the more harshly felt when they have dependents, whether they're working or not. So I just want to pass back to Shireen, because Shireen's also been doing work in this kind of context in a different way.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I mean, I think when you were speaking then, that I was thinking that, you know, it just made me feel that there's a continuous struggle with costs, isn't it? That, and I think that, you know, people are, there's always a struggle. Men try to push the costs of child rearing onto women. Organizations try to do that as well. There's a sort of a battle going on between the state, organizations, individuals, and within households as well, between household members. And it may not just be between heterosexual members of heterosexual couples, it's also across generations, where you know, in the UK, a really high proportion of children have some form of childcare given by grandparents. So there's a sort of real contestation about who's going to pay for care, and providing egg freezing to me just seems like, why don't they, it just makes me ask myself, why don't they just make it possible for people to work and to be able to progress in their careers? Because much of the research that I did with Emma Cusack on professional women showed that actually women, we interviewed women who'd gone back to work and then left, and they had good jobs. They could even afford childcare. They were well off, but they didn't like the way they were treated at work. They were shunted into sort of less important roles. They had little chance of progressing. They were not invited to the social events, and even if they had been, they couldn't go to these evening events. So it actually became almost impossible for them to maintain the same status. They could have continued at work in a lower status position. So yeah, so I think, I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that kind of, we can see that in this context that actually the situation isn't getting much better, actually. But I do want to kind of end on a slightly more positive note by saying that there have been some challenges to this context and to challenging this status quo. Particularly, I want to kind of lastly just focus in the UK context. So there has been a number of kind of activism going on around these types of issues at the moment. And I've been doing some research with Caitlin Mendez in the University of Western Ontario about a hashtag that came out in the pandemic called But Not Maternity. And what this hashtag did, it was specifically interested with how, with giving voice to the public, healthcare workers and campaigners to share their experiences about pandemic maternity care inequality and how pregnant women were being disproportionately, in their view, discriminated because they didn't have a birthing partner. Now, the hashtag saw an alliance kind of emerge, and it really exemplifies, in my view, that we are seeing and have been seeing for quite a while, actually, various different types of feminist activism related to reproductive politics. And I think that whilst kind of when it gets into the mainstream, and the research I did with Caitlin actually showed that it was taken up in some problematic ways. But I do think the kind of push towards this type of activism is really important, and we can think about it in relation to care and work as well. I was talking about it in terms of healthcare, but we can think about how, say, in the pandemic context, we know that the relationship between care and work has worsened. So the Care Collective call it a kind of crisis of care. And for example, the Women's Budget Group know that whilst men and women caring for children increased on both sides during the pandemic, it was disproportionately felt by women again. And this was, certain types of women, marginalized women, were seen to struggle even more within this context. So we can see how this care work situation has been exacerbated by the pandemic. But at the same time, what we can see is that there is more activism going on, like But Not Maternity. So there are other campaigns that have run by organisations like Pregnant Then Screwed, who have been questioning the prohibitive cost of childcare recently, this week, in fact. And they are arguing that the government, we need some form of welfare to help around childcare. So on Monday, the charity Pregnant Then Screwed were reported that that they were doing their work, and there's going to be a cross-parliamentary group headed by Stella Creasy about this issue. But Jolie Brearley notes from Pregnant Screwed that childcare is infrastructure, and that without access to good quality, affordable childcare, this is a quote, sorry, and early years provision, parents are forced out of their jobs and back into the home, rendering them unable to financially contribute to their family and the economy. So what this really highlights, I think, is there's a lot of amazing work going on. And although this is kind of framed within the economy, we need to value all of this type of work. And we need to think about the structural constraints and inequalities that are embedded within, say, the UK system when we're having conversations about work and care. Because otherwise it's not really much of a choice, because not everyone can make this choice, right, because of these inequalities. So I think we need to start thinking towards the kind of societal and collective efforts in order to make such choices a reality for all, really. And I'll end there.